Eidolons are always a bit of a weird subject in Star Rail. For a big portion of the player base, they'll never even consider them and only ever touch them when the gacha gods decide to bless them one day. Now, regardless, I wanted to take a look at our early Eidolons and choose some that I think are the best if you do decide to invest a little more than usual on your characters. Now, before we get into the actual list, I need to do a quick disclaimer and explanation. I want to make it very clear that Eidolons on characters are never necessary for clearing content, and all characters are capable at E0S0. Some older, power-crept characters might struggle, but they will always be able to help clear content that is suited to them. You should only really go for Eidolons if you really want to, regardless of how strong the ones we talk about on this list are. And for our actual list, I decided to split it into two categories. Our first three are going to be Eidolons on DPS characters, and then the last three are going to be on support characters. And finally, this is only about early Eidolons, so only E1s or E2s. If we were to talk about the actual strongest Eidolons, E6s would take over the list, and at that level of investment, every character is absurdly broken anyways. Okay, finally we can kick off, and the first of our DPS Eidolons is going to be from an older character, and that's going to be E2 Imbibe the Lunay. What his E2 does is it almost transforms him into a Sealy type character. Whenever Imbibe the Lunay uses his ultimate, his action is advanced 100% and he gains an extra stack of Squarma Sacrosanta, which is one of those free skill points from his ultimate. So essentially, after every ult, he gets a completely free turn where he can use a 3-charge basic attack that does not cost skill points. This is obviously going to be on top of his E1 that gives him 40% damage, but we'll try and look at this E2 in isolation. Now, this isn't an Eidolon that changes the number. The amount of damage his 3-charge basic is going to be exactly the same as if he had E1 Dan Heng. But with the amount of times you use his ult in a fight, especially with Ting Yun, which you do normally use with him, this is going to be a lot of extra turns, which can amount to a lot of extra damage. To give you an idea, in this run I did on the current MOC with Imbibe the Lunay, Sparkle and Ting Yun, I used 5 ultimates in 4 cycles. With E2, this would have been 5 extra turns. Now, in this clear, my Dan Heng only had 6 turns to begin with, so adding a 5 extra turns on top of that is almost doubling the amount of actions he takes. Now, obviously the enemies probably would have died and I wouldn't have made it to that 5th extra turn, but it just gives you an idea of how many turns E2 can give you. And also, if you are playing with Huo Huo and using Quid Pro Quo on her, you can speed him up even more. For our next Eidolon, we're going to be jumping forward into Penacony with Acheron's E2. Now, E2 Acheron is a bit of a weird one. The Eidolon states that the number of Nihility characters required for her A4 trace, the Abyss, to achieve its highest possible effect is reduced by 1. And when Acheron's turn starts, she gains 1 point of Slash Stream and inflicts 1 stack of Crimson Knot onto the enemy with the most stacks already. Now the second part is pretty straightforward as to why it's good. 1 point of Slash Stream when her turn starts is just 1 stack towards her ultimate. Building faster ults is always a good thing. The Crimson Knot stacks is also part of her ult, and inflicting more is just more damage. But the first part of the Eidolon is where it gets a bit interesting. This basically removes Acheron's need to have 2 Nihilities on the team to make full use of her major trace. Now, this doesn't sound like too much at first until you realize how impactful our Harmony characters are. Nihility characters like Pella and Silverwolf and Jiaochu aren't bad by any means, but there's a reason why almost every hypercarry setup prefers to use double Harmony unless there's something like Acheron's major trace or Ratio relying on debuffs. Right now, our general best option is going to be Sparkle, as the advanced forward helps Acheron build her ult stacks, and Sparkle is really good for hypercarry setups. But this Eidolon can also help lead to more in the future. While E0 Acherons are mainly just looking at new Nihility units and seeing if they synergize well with the Acheron, E2 Acheron havers also get to shop through new Harmony units. Now, for our final DPS character, we're going with a fan favorite, which is Firefly and her E2. Now, just like Dan Heng's E2 we talked about earlier, we're going for more of a Sealy-esque upgrade, except this time it's literally just Sealy's Resurgence. When Firefly uses an enhanced basic or skill in her ult state, if that attack kills an enemy target or weakness breaks them, she immediately gains an extra turn. Now this time we do need to talk about the E1, because this E2 would kinda be terrible without it. Firefly's E1 gives her skill a 15% defense ignore, which is fine, it's a good damage increase, but it also makes it that her enhanced skill just doesn't consume skill points. So at E2, we have Firefly sitting at 200 plus speed, so she's moving constantly, and whenever it is her turn, there's a good chance she's gonna get an extra one, because breaking weaknesses is super easy for her, and killing enemies in AoE situations at least is also really easy. And then thanks to her E1, you don't even have to worry about skill points. Giving an already broken base character like Firefly Seele's Resurgence is, well, as you guessed, really broken. Okay, before we move on to our support ones, I do want to give some honorable mentions to some other really great Eidolons that I think are really strong but just didn't make the list in my opinion. Black Swan's E1 is the go-to for vertical investment for dot teams, as it just reduces enemies' resistance by 25%. Topaz's E1 doesn't give the most damage out of the Eidolons we've talked about, but for the IPC follow-up team using Dr. Ratio, the extra debuff can be very important as the team does lack debuffs. Jade's E1 is another very interesting one that makes her playable in different game modes. If we looked at the increase this Eidolon gives to Jade by herself in a one target scenario, this would be one of the biggest damage increases in the game. Jingliu has a similar E1 where it gives her a huge increase in single target while not doing much in 3 target scenarios. And finally Fei Xiao. Fei Xiao is our newest character and already considered one of the strongest DPSs in the game at E0S0, but her E1 gives her a very significant damage increase, while her E2 helps her stack her ult a lot faster, which can be very important for hitting breakpoints. Overall, these are really amazing Eidolons on some already amazing characters that I thought definitely deserved at least a mention in this video. Okay, time to move on to our support characters. And if you followed any discussion about zero cycling and Eidolons, these should be fairly obvious as to what's coming. We're gonna start with Ruanmei. Ruanmei's E1 makes it that while her ult field is active, all damage dealt by allies ignores 20% of defense. It's a very straightforward Eidolon, it just is really strong. Now, it is pretty important that this is def ignore. Firstly, stacking defense ignore is just really good. It scales incredibly well the more you get and can lead to absurd amounts of damage increases. So whether you get some extra defense ignore from a light cone, from other characters, or from relics like the Quantum set, putting this on top of Ruanmei's E1 is very valuable. We also just have how universal Ruanmei is. She doesn't just play with crit scaling DPS, but also she's the premium support for dot and break. Now, having this E1 focus on defense ignore makes it so that it doesn't matter what damage the team is doing, this will always have an impact. For our next support Eidolon is going to be Sparkle's E2. Now, we're following a very common theme for our support Eidolons here, as Sparkle's E2 is another defense ignore one. For every stack of her talent, all allies will ignore 8% of the target's defense while dealing damage. Now, her talent can stack up to 3 times, which makes this E2 give a total of 24% defense ignore. Now, we don't need to go over why defense ignore is so strong, since we already talked about it with Ruanmei, but what makes this slightly better is the uptime is basically permanent. Sparkle's talent gains stacks when allies use skill points, which is most of the time. So as soon as you've used 3 skill points into combat, this talent will be maxed out, and then you'll have that Death Shred basically permanently. And finally, for our last one, this should come to no surprise, Robin's E1. Now, Robin's E1 states that when the Concerto state is active, all allies gain 24% all-type Respen. Now, Respen is not the same as Death Shred, but it basically does the same thing. You're just getting a universal damage increase. The Concerto state is Robin's ult, so when her ult is active, you'll be receiving this E1 buff. And with the way you play with Robin, most of the damage output you'll be doing is during the ult. So even though the uptime is not that great, especially if you don't have her signature light cone, you'll still be getting a lot of damage out of this Eidolon. And just overall with these support Eidolons that we've talked about, if you need any proof as to how powerful and game-changing they can be, if you've ever seen someone clear a stage with a very impressive character, maybe they zero cycled with Blade in non-win week, or they cleared with a weaker 4-star character, or you have the exact same build as them but you just do less damage, normally it's off the back of 1 or 2 of these insanely strong support Eidolons. And that's pretty much it. If you feel like I missed mentioning some other insanely strong Eidolons, sorry I missed them, and definitely just let me know in the comments. And just a final reminder, never feel pressured to pull for Eidolons just for strength. An easy way to think about it is if you miss the entirety of just stage 12 in MOC, you literally miss out on around one pull, so definitely don't stress about it too much.